Welcome back to Timo's Dinky Detailing. Today I'm going to be doing a Dinky 355 Lunar Roving vehicle. This is a toy that was given to me by my good friend. He always manages to pick up something for me when he's on vacation, and he picked this up, I guess, in the UK. And it's a very nice toy. It's a Lunar Rover, and it's in a scratched up condition, but it also has the wheels, axles are bent, and this toy has tractor tires that look like black rubber. Of course, the real Lunar Rover didn't have rubber tires, it had wire mesh tires. And so I'm going to try and make this more like the real thing. It's got these astronauts. They're going to need to be cleaned up and touch up the paint on them. They look kind of stiff sitting there, so I'm starting to think that I might upgrade those guys a little bit. And it's a pretty chunky looking model, and actually the Lunar Rover itself is very chunky and utilitarian. So these tires are in very good condition. I'm not going to reuse those, but those are going to go into my box of goodies. And maybe one day I'll have a tractor that needs those. Now these are very sloppy. The wheels on the axles are loose, and some of them are bent. The axles are bent. So I'm going to see what's up with that and try and fix that as well. So the base is held on to the top part with 2 screws, and the screws actually go into another plate on the top, which has some decoration. And this is the rear plate. Oh no, that's the front one. That's a solar array. And then the back has a more generic storage type of thing. And now the body comes apart, and it's got this complicated mechanism because it's front and back steering. And there's the top that's fairly simple. And I'm looking carefully at the way this thing is assembled because I'm going to have to put it back together again, and it looks like a nightmare. So there's the steering mechanism. So like usually these Dinky toys are made fairly robust and very clever design, and it works extremely well, but I think that's going to be a serious challenge to put back together again. So there's the controls. It has a little cap on it. And that part, it looks like it's bent, but I have a feeling that's intentional. So I'm not going to try and straighten that out. And here you can see a lot of play in these wheels. And they're also, a couple of the axles are actually bent. So I'm going to see if I can take, it looks like it's pressed in, and you can see little splines, so you know it's pressed in. So won't come off by hand. I have to put it into the vise, and I put it in with the soft jaws, which are made of aluminum. And then I'm very gentle with it, and it comes off not that difficult. But there you can see it's bent. Now, the problem with straightening something like that is it's so short, it's hard to see if you've straightened it completely. So it's definitely going to be a challenge. That's 3, and that's 4. So there's all the parts. Tires, astronauts I put away, and all of the big parts with paint on them go into this bucket for paint stripping. Now the small parts, which is these axles, they have a little bit of orange paint on them. I'm not going to put those in the caustic soda. I'm going to use the paint stripper because I'm worried that those things are going to, and the rinsing of the caustic soda, are going to wind up going down the sink. So I'm going to do them a little bit differently on a separate thing. It's just a tiny bit anyway. So the rest of it goes outside, the boiling water and the caustic soda. And on these Dinky toys, the caustic soda, you can see the water turns orange. So the paint is soft enough that it's very easy to strip. So the casting all looks good. It was not, I mean, it was played with rough enough that the axles got bent, but the rest of the castings are all in excellent condition. There's no dents or major scratches or bends or anything in them. So to clean them up, I'm using the wire wheel on the drill press. It's way faster and much quieter than using a Dremel tool. So I'm able to clean those up quickly. And now back to these. These have been soaking now for a few hours. And you can see the paint has dissolved. It's in the paint stripper. So it's kind of hard to clean those, but actually the paint is stripped off so much you hardly have to touch them to clean it up. So there, I rinsed them off, and you can see how bent a couple of those are. So I'm going to try and straighten these out. So the friend who bought this toy for me is Oliver, and if you watch the video of the Shadow Interceptor, that was his toy, and he commissioned me to repair it. And this one, he didn't suggest anything, but I thought, I know he wanted his to be repaired and to look like the one that's on the TV show. And so in this one, on the same spirit, I'm gonna make this toy look like the real Lunar Rover. So I've got to match everything that was on the real Lunar Rover. So here, straightening out this tiny little axle is a challenge. All that hammering, and it still looks like it's all bent like a pretzel. And it wouldn't work in the soft jaw because it just sunk into the aluminum. So here, I'm getting a little bit more purchase from the end for some reason. Maybe it's just because I can see it better. And now it looks pretty straight. Actually, it's a bit crooked. So it goes back in, a little bit more hammering. So I'm leaving all this in so you can see that this is it's not the simplest thing to do. At one point I was thinking of putting in shoulder screws that I would have been able to thread those little holes, and a shoulder screw would go on. The shoulder screw would be perfectly straight, and I opted against it because the shoulder screw had a large head, and that head would be very visible on the final model. And later on I thought, well, I could have made a hubcap for it. Anyway, I wound up using the original shafts, and I regret it a little bit. So I have to do this one over again. I will thread those and make the wheels fit the shoulder screws. So I'm using ordinary metallic silver paint for all these parts. Here's wheels that I have 3D printed. I drew them in Tinkercad and then printed them on my resin 3D printer. My friend Oliver, who got me this thing, he does my 3D printing, but now I have my own 3D printer, and this one is the resin kind, so it can do the fine details. So one of these pins was broken off, which I didn't notice on the toy when it was put together, but I remember the wheels were all floppy in different ways. Well, this one was floppy because it's missing the pin that's supposed to set it up right. So I've drilled a tiny little hole there, and this is a 256 screw, and I'm going to use it. The head will be the upper pin. So this is a tiny little tap, so I've got to be very careful turning it in there and put lots of lubricant, because if it breaks in there, it's going to be a bit of trouble. So now, the original toy was all orange, and if you look at the real Lunar Rover, it does have kind of orange fenders. So in that way, orange is correct. And actually, some of the models were made correctly. They were silver, or I think they were silver with orange fenders. So I'm mixing my orange and a little bit of the Mr. Hobby thinning or leveling thinner, and that makes it so that the paint dries slowly and gets shiny even after you've painted it. So this will be just for the fenders. The rest of it's going to be silver and white. So there it goes as orange. And I just show the one, but actually I obviously paint, I show two. So I paint all four of these with this orange color. And then later on I was looking at it and I'm thinking, actually some of the pictures it looks like more like a metallic copper, which when I saw that I go, well, that's fantastic. I'm going to go with the, I'm going to go get some copper paint. So I've ordered some copper paint. In the meantime, this is painted orange, and then I can put this, I shortened this screw that I had, and it goes in there, and that'll be my upper pivoting pin. It looks good, but in the end, it's a little bit loose. You can't tell when you're doing it this because the gravity is holding it straight, but it is a little bit floppy still. But I didn't know that at the time. The model is just a little bit too complicated, and as a result there's tolerance stacks, and no matter what you do with it, it's going to be floppy unless I replaced it with those shoulder screws. That would have been the thing to do, but I didn't, and it would have been floppy anyway because that pin is a little bit too small and the whole fender is floppy. So here's the console. The rest of it's painted silver. I painted the console white, and then I also painted this back panel white and the solar array. Now this is a 3D printed part that Oliver had sent along with the toy, and these are for the parts that weren't on the Dinky version. And here I've printed out my own astronauts. I found astronaut on Thingiverse, and in the computer I cut him to pieces and made him sitting instead of standing, and I made a left and right one. This is the guy on the left side, and he's reaching over to the controls. So now I've got my copper paint, and what I'm doing is I'm mixing up a lighter color than the copper by mixing silver with it, because the antenna dish has a lighter, very fine color. So that's what I've done here. And what I did was I could print this thing, and I'm looking at this, and my son says too that this is done on the 3D printer that has the filament, and you can see where the filaments are, and it kind of gives it a look of a mesh, but it also has a lot of little artifacts in there. So I got this thing painted up, and then we'll have a look at how it looks on the model. Now here's just the copper, and this is a little acrylic paint thinner. Now these are Vallejo paints. I've been using Mr. Hobby mostly, but I'm got Vallejo for something else, and now I start really liking it, so I've stocked up on a bunch of Vallejo paints and I'm trying them out. So this is metallic copper, and I did metallic on the mobile Shadow Mobile too, and it was just beautiful paint. And once again, I'm putting this stuff over the orange, and it just looks stunning. So I really like this, at least in the metallic paints. It's just gorgeous. So here I go and I do all four of them now in copper, and it gives it a nice, sharp, beautiful metallic look instead of just the rusty looking paint. Now here I've got my gold metallic. This is a Mr. Hobby paint, and I'm not spraying it on because that's going to be pretty hard to spray the front glass of the space helmet. So with a brush it goes on really uneven, so this is just a first coat, and I come back later and do a second coat on it to try and make it a little bit more even. But I really like my astronaut. He looks looks a little bit more animated than those poor guys that came from Dinky. So I'm going to have those. Oops. I'm going to have those guys extra. So if anybody is interested in wants to have a couple of the original astronauts, if they're missing them, I'm willing to trade them for a Dinky toy that needs to be repaired. So contact me below. So I'm just putting a little bit of detail. It looks crappy looking up close, but it's a toy, and a little splotch of paint gives you the correct illusion. And so when you're looking at the toy from any short distance, it looks pretty good. So most of the spacesuit is completely white, and there's no colorful accessories on it. The only thing that isn't white is these soles of the boots, and they're light gray. So make those gray. And what's great is this guy was standing, and the guy modeled in the bottom of the boots, which are visible on my model, so I'm happy he did that. So this again is the guy on the left side, and he's got his arm out there reaching, and I just cut him apart in the software and glued them back together and in the shape I wanted. And Tinkercad isn't really good at blending parts or anything like that, so I just stuck them back together. It's a tiny little thing, and even if you notice it, still looks better than the little rubber guys that came with the original. So these guys get American flag on their left shoulder. On the right shoulder they didn't have anything, but I decided to put a little NASA logo, and this is the NASA original one from the 60s. Oh, I got stuck to my thumb. Got it off. And managed to get it there. I could have just cut out another one, but I had the chance to rescue it. Now these things traveling to the moon, they were covered in gold foil all over the place, and that was for reflecting sunlight off of sensitive components or things that would suffer if they had to heat up. And so I bought some of this stuff from the dollar store. It's peel and stick copper, well, gold chrome stuff, and it looks like that foil that they had. The only problem is it doesn't wrinkle up like the foil, the real foil. So I wind up covering this thing, and it looks a little bit straight, but anyway, I did my best. It's just a toy after all. So I'm kind of cutting the corners, and now I'm peeling off the peel and stick, and it's going to be kind of like wrapping a tiny little Christmas present, and it's driving me crazy because it's so tiny and it's flimsy stuff, and it just wants to move around on its own. So I've cut all these little bits and trying to package it like a Christmas present, and it's a bit of a challenge. And then I've cut these little bits, and sometimes I just don't want to go, and now it got stuck on the other side, so getting a little bit frustrated. So now my fingers have been all over that thing, so it's losing some of its stick, and so now it's wrapped around, and it wants to unwrap itself. So I don't show it, but later on I glue down that stuff from underneath using epoxy glue. So now this is my solar panel. So what I'm doing, I've painted it white, and now I'm sanding off the paint that's on the little solar panels that are on the top, because there's different segments. So it takes a bit to get them all sanded, and then they will, there you can see, so they will look like a whole bunch of little squares. It'd be impossible or very difficult to paint that, but it's very easy to just sand off the paint off of those high points. So now it looks more like a solar panel. And then I'm going to put, this one has the gold foil around it. So I've just cut a strip and I'll try and bend it up to make it look like the wrinkly stuff that's on the real thing. So I do all this folding, and it turns out I was just folding the paper backing. By the time I peel this thing off, the foil is perfectly smooth. So it's a clever idea, it just didn't work. So I'll try a different thing, and that is when I'm sticking it down, I'll try and deliberately fold it up so that it sticks and looks crooked. So I spend a lot of time doing this. It's very finicky work. I'm not sure I got my value out of it, but it is on the final model. There were other parts that I could have wrapped in the gold foil, but after doing these two bits, I said this is too finicky, and that's all the gold it's going to have. Oh, there's one more piece, but it winds up being covered anyway. So now here's my little pin, and here's the wheels, and I've designed those. They look sort of like the real thing. We got the wire mesh. This was all done in Tinkercad, and I'm surprised I was able to get all that detail into them, because it's a fairly simplistic software. So you can't see the hammer in this shot because the part's so small, you wouldn't see anything. So there you can see it's still loose. So I'm going to drive it a little deeper into the casting. See, I back away and still my hammer's not in it. I'm just using the side of the hammer. There's not a lot of force required to do this. There's a little bit deeper. So it looks pretty good. So move on to the next one. And tap it in. And at this point I'm thinking, this is so finicky, I can understand why those wheels are so floppy, which is probably disappointing. It's probably disappointing for a child to get this toy and the wheels are so floppy. So that's all of them. On this one I'm going to cover, this is that back panel, and I go to the trouble of doing this, and I wind up covering most of it up anyway with another component that I'll show you a little bit later. So it's the same thing as before, and this time I'm covering the whole thing, so in theory it's a little bit simpler. So now again I'm going to fold up these edges like I'm wrapping a present, and it seems like a good idea, but really it's kind of awkward, and by pressing those things down I lose my adhesive surface, so these edges don't want to stay down. Fortunately, at least when this one goes on, it's going to be clamped on there so that the gold foil is going to be held in place by the casting being actually screwed onto the other part. So it's just a matter of poking that stuff in there when it comes to reassembling the model. So now I'm going to try to reassemble. Most of the components are done already. And putting this thing back together, if I have to ever do this again, I'm going to build a custom jig first. It's going to hold up this casting, and then it's going to support all these little fender assemblies, and it's got to hold them up while you're assembling the thing. So they must have had something at Dinky, a whole jig that would hold all these parts together, so that the worker could just put all the parts in place, and then put the base, the bottom of the base, on top of it, and screw it down, and everything's tickety-boo. But when you're trying to hold this thing up with one hand and try to put this thing on the top of it with the other, you just run out of hands. So this definitely needs to have a jig. And if somebody's watching this and is going to restore their own lunar roving vehicle, I really highly suggest you make some wooden stand that's going to hold this base up, and then it has to have some little protrusions sticking out that are going to hold up those wheels once you put them into place, or those fenders. Because otherwise, you can see it's just a nightmare. And I'm showing the whole thing just so you can see. This is my first attempt at this, and I do get the whole thing together. And then later on, I had to take a piece apart to repair it, and I don't show that, but this is the process of getting the whole thing together. So the second time I put it together, maybe it was a little bit easier, but it was still a pain in the keister. Then you get, look at, I've got three wheels on there, and then I can't lift the casting conveniently to get the last one on. So the mechanism is in the right place because it's steering. Now I got to get this last one on, and I can't like just lift that corner. It doesn't want to move up at all. I put a screwdriver and it still won't go up. It's just a really complex design, and it's not really meant to be put together like this. It needs to be on a special jig that would hold everything in place until you get it all together. So this is just a battle to get it to come together, and there it is. It's all together, and now I've got to put these blocks on top, because that's what the screw goes into. And fortunately, I can just do one half at a time, because I can hold it together. And here the foil is sticking out. So what do? Well, you take a screwdriver and poke it under. So now that's on, and I can put the screw. And then once that one's on, the front is unlikely to come apart once that screw is in. So my solar array goes on there, and then this screw screws into that. I don't know why they couldn't have cast all that into the top part. They could have cast it all in one, but they did it this way for some reason that we don't know about. Maybe it's got to do with the way it's has to be assembled. So there I've drilled a little hole in the bottom of my astronaut, and that will go through the hole that those rubber astronauts were clinging onto. So I think these guys look great. Whoever on Thingiverse designed these astronauts, they look just perfect. I don't know, you couldn't do that kind of a job in Tinkercad, so there's obviously more different software you can use that's better designed for making these organics type of designs. So I'm glad somebody did that, so I wouldn't have to design a whole astronaut. So now the control goes on top, and basically the toy is complete at this stage, but it's not complete for me because it's missing all kinds of stuff. it's missing, for example, this radio dish. And actually it's missing a whole bunch of stuff, because one thing, when you look at the pictures of the Lunar Rover, it was just bristling with stuff, with antennae and machinery and computers and God knows what, and wires all over the place. So if you wanted to make one really accurate, you'd have to stick all these wires everywhere. But it definitely has to have this this communication dish. So I'm putting it together with 5-minute epoxy, which I use for a lot of things on these models. And there it goes. Whoops. And I'm holding the whole thing in place with a parallel clamp, which is machinist clamp, and it's very handy for stuff like this. It's heavy enough that it holds this assembly and it clamps to it. And then I got the thing on there and I had to hold it for 5 minutes. So that's what I did, and now it's hardened and it's ready to go. So here I've got a little dab of blue paint into the camera lens. This is a TV camera. And now it's got a blue lens. So now it looks like exactly like the real thing. So that whole bar goes on to the front of the Lunar Rover, also held on with some epoxy. So that wants to fall over. So I have to find some way to hold that up. So 5 minutes of holding it with my finger, and then it's done. Now the wheels look a little too silvery, and so I'm using, and this is designed, this is the panel line paint, so it's got a very light thinner in it and some color, and it goes into the low point. So I used this on the wheels to give it a little bit more character, a little bit more definition. And I think it does look a little bit better. And then I came in, because when I sprayed the copper paint, I sprayed it on the one side and I left the inside of the fenders silver. I suppose I could have painted the whole thing copper, but I didn't. So on the outside it doesn't look right. So I came now with a brush to finish off the copper look. And on these fenders, there is an American flag on each one. So I come in with a decal of the American flag, and we'll put it there. And it makes it look, I mean, the fenders aren't correct. The fenders are actually, they wrap all the way around those wheels, but that would have been a lot more difficult to cast and to assemble. So they've obviously made a shortcut and just had it like a half a fender. And those fenders were actually like really important, because when they didn't have adequate fenders on the first Lunar Rover, the sand from the moon's surface would fly off of the wheels like rooster tails, and then it would, for 20 minutes, the dust would be falling back down on the Lunar Rover. So it was really bad. So they had to make it a full half circle around the wheels. Now this is the back of the Lunar Rover always has a bunch of crap and different things from different pictures. So I went on to Thingiverse and I just looked for something that looked complicated. So I found this. This is a part of a different model, and what I did was, it looked nice and complicated with all kinds of hoses and wires and crap, and it's all modeled in there. So I printed this out. What I did was I stretched and pulled it until it fit the dimensions that I needed for the back of the Lunar Rover, and I added these antennae, and they look kind of like the antennae that are on the thing, because you got to have this stuff or the thing just doesn't look right. So I made this thing. It's really complicated, and then I went in and I detailed some of it, and because it's so much detail and I want it to look right, so I painted different colors. And here I went with copper. This thing looks like, it looks like an armature of a motor, so I painted the part that would be the windings. with the copper paint. And then I like the copper, so some of these pipes will get some copper. And I did a bunch of colors. Now I'm looking at this thing, and I printed one out on my resin printer, and it just looks way better. So I decided I'm going to go with the resin one. So the project was already finished, and I wasn't happy with it. So this is one of the things that I upgraded. And now I went with my gold paint, and again brushing it on, because I suppose it would have been easier to spray this thing with the gold paint and then paint those ribs white. In hindsight, I think if I had to do it over again, that's what I would do. But in this case, I went in and I painted all of those segments gold instead. And now here's another part that was missing, and this is the control panel. This is Tinkercad, so I need to make this part longer. So you type in the number, and then I print it out, and there's the part. This has already been painted. It was cast in this green resin that I had, and it's already painted white. And here I've got a decal I made. This actually, I found a picture of the control panel, and it was a picture from an angle, so I had to stretch and pull the thing to be straight, and all of the switches and stuff are looking crooked on this thing, but it's so tiny you can't really see it, so it just looks like a complex thing, and it is accurate to the real thing. And it looks a little bit different than the real one. Actually, it was different on different versions, but I made this one the way I did because it's actually completely wrong, because at the bottom of that control panel is the grip where the astronaut would hold the control. And I couldn't do that because there's already a control. So anyway, I made a simplified version that has all the features, so it looks right, as long as you're not comparing it side by side with a picture of the real thing. And that's got an antenna sticking on top as well. So there's my control panel. So once again, the 5-minute epoxy from the dollar store, and we'll stick it on the bottom of this thing and glue it into place. This is turning out to be the longest video since I did the El Camino. But the El Camino was my most popular video, and it's the longest one, and I was always taught that if you make it longer than half an hour, nobody's going to watch it. But for some reason they watched the El Camino, so I'm hoping they'll watch this one too, because there's just so much of work in doing this thing. So here's my complicated components on the back, and it doesn't matter what they look like because they had so many different versions, and they always look like just a mass jumble. There's no way you could model it accurately, so I found something that was already complicated and stuck it there, and I think it just looks great. So here my epoxy is cured, so I can take that little piece of tape off of it. Now that front bar, I can put the camera back on, and then I've got my new radio dish. And what I've done is I've drilled a hole in that. The shaft was too thick, so this is a piece of aluminum wire, and I've painted it white, and then my new dish goes on that, and I'm much happier with that one. It kind of matches the slick look of the rest of it. So let's remind you of where we started. We got the orange painted toy. It's in reasonably good condition, but it doesn't look like the real Lunar Rover. And so you can see the wheels are twisted. Well, they're still twisted on the final one, which is unfortunate, but sometimes that's life. So let's see what it looks like now. Okay, I think I've captured the look of the real thing a little bit better anyway. I've got my astronauts look a little bit more accurate and complicated, And then I've got all those accessories with antennae poking up and all kinds of complexity. And I think it looks a lot like a real lunar rover, and it has the balance where these things are sticking up. It has to have them or it just doesn't look right. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Timo's Dinky Detailing. Looks like I'm out of time. So until next time, be seeing you.